Joining us now is Dr. Julian Fidge, a firefighter from Wangaratta in northeast Victoria, in the high country close to the snowfields, where he has lived for many years. Julian is also a former officer in the Australian Army. He's a pharmacist and is a rural general practitioner who runs a respected local medical practice. He's a member of the CFA, but he's not speaking on their behalf. He's speaking on his own behalf today. Julian has spent much of the summer voluntarily fighting fires, particularly the horrendous Carbour fire. He accuses Victorian Premier Dan Andrews of being reckless and negligent and incompetent in the management of the state forests, which have caused such devastation and misery for thousands. Joining us now, Dr. Julian Fidge. How are you, Julian?
Good morning.
Happy Australia Day, and well done on fighting so many fires. Now, kick off, tell us just briefly a little bit about yourself, your background in firefighting and in the Wangaratta community, and then tell us about the fires you've been fighting recently before we get on to who's to blame.
Sure. I'm a married man. I live with my wife and children just south of Wangaratta on the family farm. We've had a farm there for about 40 years. And I have a medical practice in Wangaratta. I'm a member of our local Laceby West Fire Brigade, and I've been out to the Carbour and the Corryong fires this summer.
Now, one of the things you've seen is fire trucks with the fire all around them. We saw all that footage over Christmas. Explain to us why fire trucks are being stuck in the middle of these fires. You have you say that this isn't normal and shouldn't be the case.
So what's happened is that the Andrews government has engaged in this magical thinking which says that if you neglect the forests, somehow they'll sort themselves out. And what it's resulted in is these conflagrations of these enormous, intense fires. And we have poor access, we need good fire breaks, and we need fuel reduction to make sure that these fires don't devastate our communities. When you're trying to push 6 or 8 tonne tanker around these goat tracks in the mountains, it can be very unnerving. And then imagine doing that in the middle of the night when there are bulldozers and other heavy machinery around you.
So are you saying not only has fuel reduction not happened to the extent it should, but they've allowed the fire tracks to become overgrown, so when there is a fire, you can't get the equipment through?
So you can push, the machinery is designed to push through all of this, but you're going over these tracks which have been poorly maintained and narrowed in, and they're easily blocked by falling and overhanging trees, and you can be trapped. And instead of having a generous fire break where you can get in easily and safely, you're forced to work in these much more dangerous conditions because of the neglect of specifically the fire breaks and the access tracks.
So, Julian, who do you blame? On Twitter, you're very clear on who you blame for the devastation of the fires. Tell us your thoughts as a fireman on what has led to the devastating bushfires we've just seen and that you've helped fight.
Well, it's neglect. It's based on these magical Greens policies which just have the opposite effect of what they're trying to achieve. So you can have fire breaks which admittedly take out some of the forest that we're trying to protect, or you can have nothing. You can have this devastation. So what the Andrews government needs to do is to take better care of our forests. We need access, we need water when we're there to fight the fires, we need enough tankers to do the job. We can't be taking tankers from other regions where they need their fire tankers. And we need to be able to work safely, and these things have to be planned and executed in daylight. It's really not on, and it wouldn't be acceptable in any industry to be doing this thing at 2 o'clock in the morning when you've got bulldozers carving out fire breaks in the middle of the night, in the middle of hundreds of emergency personnel. It's
James.
not on.
Since at least the 1939 Royal Commission into that year's horror bushfires, we have seen time and again government's royal commissions and inquiries say that hazard reduction is the key to preventing these tragedies. And every single time they go back, 10 years later, there's another disaster, and they say, oh, well, they never actually did the amount of hazard reduction that was required, and that's on a state level. Do you think that at some point the federal government is going to have to come in and say this is more of a federal responsibility because states just can't leave the management of these forests to their local politics?
I don't know what the law is around that, whether the federal government can actually step in and take over the forests, but something needs to change, because what happens is the state government gets to shift all of the cost onto the federal government. So the state government says, I'm not going to spend any money. So Daniel Andrews' government says, we're not going to spend any money on the state forests, we're just going to lock them up. And then you have these catastrophic bushfires, and then the federal government has to step in and make all the reparations, and they end up spending all the money. So it's also about cost shifting. So maybe the federal government should think about relieving the load on their purse by getting in there and doing the cheap and effective forest management.
Well, speaking of that, Julian, and we've got to go in a second, but you mentioned that there were some instances where the fires were successfully controlled, and that was where private enterprise, logging industries and so on, managed to protect their areas by having adequate fire breaks and so on. Tell us about that.
Yes, okay, so what happens is if you have adequate equipment, then you can call it in, you can construct these fire breaks, and then you can do good quality back burning in good time, and without fuel, of course, the fire dies out. And that's what happened at Carbor a couple of weeks ago. It was a really good operation. There wasn't much water used in putting out the fires, but it was machinery. You send in bulldozers and graders, you create a fire break, and you light your fires backburn from your fire break back up to the fire, and of course no fuel, no fire.
Absolutely. Dr. Julian Fidge, thanks so much for coming on Outsiders. Congratulations on being a volunteer. All the Outsiders applaud all the Australians who volunteer to help fight the fires. You do a fantastic job. We're all very proud of you. And please, if more people, if the politicians would listen to people with the common sense of people like you, Julian. Thanks so much for coming on Outsiders.